April 14th, 1943. The station Frupak, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The cryptographer's room. The air in the basement was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Dozens of men and women hunched over tables, deciphering endless streams of Japanese naval codes. The silence was broken only by the monotonous clatter of teletypes, the creaking of chairs, and the whispering of translators. In this chaos, nuggets of invaluable information were born that could change the course of the war. On that day, the pencil of Technical Sergeant Harold Fudena, a Nisi translator from the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, methodically printed English words on a piece of paper, converting the intercepted characters of the JN-25 cipher. The message coming from the headquarters of the Japanese Joint Fleet was so detailed that it seemed incredible. It contained a schedule for the inspection trip of Admiral Isoroka Yamamoto, commander of the entire Japanese fleet, with an accurate schedule to the minute, route, and types of aircraft. Departure at 0600 Tokyo time on April 18th from Rabaul. Arrival at Balale Airfield at 08 Mobile. Transportation on 2 Type 1 Betty bombers. Escort 60 fighters. Fudena double-checked the translation with the original cipher. Japanese military pedantry, their blind faith in the security of their own codes, provided them with information of incredible value. Commander William Goggins, who led Frupak operations, instantly appreciated the significance of the interception. Within minutes, the decoded message was placed on the desk of Commander Edwin Layton, an intelligence officer in the Pacific Fleet. Layton, an experienced analyst who had gone through pre-war intelligence school in Japan, couldn't believe his eyes. The architect of Pearl Harbor, a man who is a symbol of Japanese military might, will be within range of American fighter jets exactly once during a narrow time window. None of them knew at the time that this single decoded telegram would launch the most daring and far-reaching interception operation in aviation history. The symbolic meaning of the goal. The Pacific War taught the American command a crucial psychological truth. Individual Japanese commanders were not just military leaders. They were living symbols of imperial urine, embodiments of the Yamato spirit. To destroy such a symbol is to deal a crushing blow to the morale of the entire enemy armada. Admiral Isoroka Yamamoto represented something more than just naval leadership. A Harvard graduate, well-traveled, and passionate poker player, Yamamoto understood America better than any other Japanese commander. His warnings about the industrial might of the United States were ignored. His reluctance to go to war with the United States was rejected. But being forced to comply, he planned the attack on Pearl Harbor with mathematical precision, won a number of tactical victories in the early campaigns, and almost achieved a decisive triumph at Midway, until American codebreakers turned the tide of the battle. His death was supposed to be an act not only of military necessity, but also of deep psychological retribution. Weapon of retaliation, Lockheed P-38G Lightning. On the runway of Fighter Strip No. 2 at Henderson Field Airfield, Guadalcanal, 18 aircraft of unusual design lined up in a row. The twin-boom silhouette of the Lockheed P-38G Lightning was one of the most recognizable in the skies of the Pacific Ocean. Two powerful Allison V1710 89-91 turbocharged 12-cylinder engines, each capable of 1,325 horsepower and 1,475 horsepower in emergency mode, accelerated the car to 414 mph at an altitude of 25,000 feet. The fuselage nacelle between the beams accommodated the pilot and a deadly set of weapons, 4 Browning M2 large-caliber machine guns, with 500 rounds of ammunition each, and a 20mm Hispano M2 cannon with 150 rounds. All weapons were concentrated in the nose, which created a converging fan of fire of incredible density, and eliminated the convergence control problems inherent in machine guns mounted in the wings. But the Lightning's main trump card was its range. With standard internal fuel tanks with a total capacity of 360 gallons and 2 outboard 165-gallon tanks, the total fuel capacity reached 690 gallons. This allowed him to have a combat range exceeding 450 miles. No other American fighter in the Pacific Theater, neither the P-39 Aero Cobra, nor the P-40 Warhawk, nor the F-4F Wildcat, could even come close to such indicators. For the Yamamoto interception mission, which required traveling hundreds of miles over the ocean, the P-38 was the only possible choice. Tactical genius, Major Mitchell's calculations. Major John William Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, stood in the operational dugout, studying weather reports and intelligence data. An experienced pilot with over 2,000 flight hours on all types of aircraft, from training Texans to the latest fighter jets, his mind processed a tactical task with the precision of an analog computer. The direct distance from Guadalcanal to the intercept point over Bougainville was 435 miles, but a direct course would have passed over a chain of Japanese islands teeming with radar surveillance posts and shore observers. Detection would be imminent. Mitchell's solution was ingenious in its simplicity and riskiness. He suggested flying in a roundabout way, going far out to sea before turning north to Bougainville. This route added 165 miles to the journey. The total distance to the target was 600 miles, the return trip was 400, a total of 1,000 miles, with a fuel reserve for the perhaps of 7 minutes of combat in emergency mode. The math was ruthless. When cruising, the Allison's two engines consumed about 100 gallons per hour at low altitude. With a flight time of about 4 hours and 30 minutes and a total fuel reserve of 690 gallons, the margin for error, headwinds, or maneuvering in combat was virtually zero. Fighter pilots, contradictory characters. Captain Thomas George Lanier, Jr., the son of a career officer and a World War I hero, was a born leader and a skilled pilot who had already scored 5 aerial victories, although some of them were disputed. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident manner, he possessed not only tactical skills, but also political acumen. At the age of 27, Lanier saw the mission against Yamamoto as his ticket to fame and a successful post-war political career. His aggressive piloting style and talent for self-promotion have earned him both fans and detractors in the squadron. First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber was the exact opposite. A native of a farm in Culver, Oregon, and an engineering student, he volunteered for the Air Force in September 1940. Barber flew with mechanical precision and quiet competence. If Lanier was looking for fame, Barber was looking for efficiency. His confirmed victories were achieved through careful positioning and accurate shooting rather than spectacular aerobatics. At the age of 25, he developed the ability to visualize the three-dimensional geometry of aerial combat with remarkable clarity. His methodical approach to battle, inherited from his engineering background, meant that every action was calculated, every risk assessed, and every shot carefully aimed. Target: Admiral Isoroka Yamamoto. At the Lakunai airfield in Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto, in his snow-white ceremonial uniform decorated with the orders of the chrysanthemum and the golden kite, reviewed the inspection schedule with his headquarters. At 59, he remained Japan's most prominent strategic thinker. Born to Isoroku Takano and adopted by the Yamamoto family, he was short, only 5 feet 3 inches, but carried himself with dignity befitting a descendant of samurai. His left hand, which was missing the index and middle fingers, lost to a Russian splinter in the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, was a silent testimony to his military prowess. While studying at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, he traveled all over America, visiting automobile factories in Detroit, oil refineries in Texas, and aircraft factories in California. This experience convinced him that war with America was ultimately futile, a belief he expressed in his famous phrase that he could run amok for 6 months, and then he would inevitably be defeated. His transport, the Mitsubishi G4M1 Type 1 bomber, known to Americans as the Betty, was the epitome of the Japanese compromise between range and security. The phenomenal range of 2,150 miles was achieved due to minimal reservations and the absence of protected fuel tanks. Its cruising speed was 200 miles per hour, and its maximum speed was 265. The aircraft's vulnerability earned it the grim nickname Hamaki, cigar, or Type 1 lighter among Japanese crews because of its tendency to flare up like a torch when hit. An escort of 6 A6M30 Model 32 fighters from the 204th Air Group was supposed to provide protection, political decision, and planning. The American plan depended entirely on maintaining the absolute secrecy of the radio game. If the Japanese command had suspected that their codes had been hacked, they would have cancelled Yamamoto's flight or changed the schedule. A team of cryptanalysts at the Hypo station, now renamed irreparable, cracked variants of the JN-25 cipher even before the battle for Midway. Their ability to read Japanese naval messages became increasingly sophisticated, progressing from partial transcriptions to almost complete text reconstruction. But each decrypted dispatch risked exposing American capabilities. The decision to act on the basis of interception required approval at the highest level. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Seas Zone, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of aviation in the Solomon Islands, and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt himself, who, according to legend, gave a simple order: get Yamamoto. The planning of the interception fell on the shoulders of several officers working in close coordination. Marine Major John Condon, operations officer at the Solomon Islands Aviation Command, created an initial flight plan by calculating fuel consumption and waypoints. His plan was rejected by Mitchell, who found the speed and time calculations unsuitable for the capabilities of the P-38. Mitchell calculated everything from scratch, working with his pilots all night to come up with a plan that maximized their chances while minimizing the risk of detection. The final route consisted of 5 precisely calculated segments, each of which was designed to avoid Japanese radar coverage, taking into account wind drift and magnetic declination. Navigation was to be carried out solely by numerical calculation, using a compass, an airspeed indicator, a clock, and mental calculations. No radio beacons to confirm the position, no landmarks above the vast ocean expanses except for occasional islands, which should have been avoided. One man's navigation skills were supposed to determine whether 18 planes would find their target or disappear into the abyss of the Pacific Ocean. Preparation and departure. 18 P-38 aircraft were selected for the operation. The 4 vehicles, piloted by Lanier, Barber, Holmes, and Hine, were designated as a strike group, whose mission was to directly attack the bombers. 12 others, led by Mitchell, were supposed to cover them from above, fighting off fighter attacks from the Japanese Kahili airfield, located just 20 miles from the interception point. 2 more aircraft were designated as backup. In the pre-dawn twilight on April 18th, the ground crews completed their final preparations under the watchful eye of their senior officers. Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey supervised the armed men, ensuring that each cartridge link was properly stowed. The fuel tanks were filled with 100-octane aviation gasoline to the last drop. Internal tanks, 360 gallons. The outboard tanks are tested for 160 gallons each. For each link of cartridges for machine guns, there were 4 regular, 1 armor-piercing, and 1 incendiary cartridge. The mechanisms for resetting the outboard tanks were checked and rechecked. A mechanical failure of even 1 latch could disrupt the aircraft's participation in the mission, or worse, lead to the tank not separating and creating fatal resistance. At 07:25 local time, 05:25 Tokyo time, Mitchell's P-38s began taking off from Fighter Strip 2 at Henderson Field. The takeoff sequence has been carefully orchestrated to minimize time and fuel consumption. Almost immediately, the mission ran into problems. Lieutenant James McClanahan's plane had a tire burst on takeoff, and his P-38, which was blown off the runway, damaged the landing gear. Lieutenant Joe Moore was forced to return due to a fuel pump failure, that prevented him from using fuel from the overhead tanks. As a result, the mission was continued by 16 Lightning aircraft. The already negligible margin of safety has been reduced even more, a long way over the ocean. Mitchell led the formation at an altitude of only 30–50 feet above the water to avoid detection by Japanese radars. Within minutes, salt spray covered the windshields, requiring frequent windshield wipers. The pilots flew in complete radio silence, maintaining formation through visual contact. Each pilot fought his own battle with monotony and fatigue. More than 2 hours of flying in formation at extremely low altitude, constantly working with the throttle levers to maintain position, monitoring instruments, and combating spatial disorientation. The Pacific Ocean rolled its waves under them in an endless succession, hypnotizing with its constancy. Several pilots later reported that they struggled with drowsiness, using various techniques, from slapping themselves to singing loudly, to stay alert. Lieutenant Roger J. Ames, who was flying in the cover group, watched the fuel consumption with growing concern. The resistance from its suspension tanks exceeded the design value, possibly due to an incorrect mounting angle or manufacturing tolerances. At current consumption, he had about 5 minutes of reserve fuel left for the return trip. The math was simple and terrifying. Burn too much fuel on the way to their destination, and they won't return home. To save too much, and they won't have enough power to maneuver in battle. Each pilot continuously made microscopic adjustments to the propeller pitch and throttle settings, balancing the demands of the mission and the likelihood of survival. The Japanese side, confidence and fatal punctuality. Meanwhile, at exactly 06 EUD Tokyo time and 08 EUD local time, 2 Betty bombers with Admiral Yamamoto and his staff on board took off from Rabaul Airfield, observing the schedule with traditional Japanese punctuality. The Admiral was reportedly in a gloomy mood. Several officers on his staff later testified that he had misgivings about the flight. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff and his close friend, took his place in the second bomber, number 326. The formation rose to a height of 6,500 feet. 6 Zero fighters took up positions in 2 formations of 3 vehicles each, positioned above and behind the bombers. Visibility was excellent, with occasional cumulus clouds at 4,000–5,000 feet, providing occasional shelter. Ensign Kenji Yanaga, who piloted the Zero with the number 3081, scanned the sky according to proven patterns hammered into him by years of training. 3 years of fighting had developed his instincts to an almost supernatural level. He could identify the type of aircraft at distances where other pilots saw only dots. His peripheral vision could detect the slightest movement against the clouds. However, this morning, his focus was mainly on maintaining an accurate position in the formation. The flight from Rabaul to Balala was performed dozens of times without incident. American fighter jets have never penetrated so far north in such numbers. The greatest danger seemed not to be the actions of the enemy, but operational accidents, interception. At 09:34 local time, after spending 2 hours and 9 minutes in the air, the Mitchell formation reached the final turning point exactly on schedule. They traveled 410 miles over an undirected ocean, relying only on numbers. Mitchell checked his specially synchronized Elgin watch against the calculated position. If his navigation was correct, they should now turn northwest to intercept. If he had made even the slightest mistake in calculating the wind or heading, they would have missed their target. He shook his wings, signaling a turn, and the 16 P-38s banked towards Bougainville at once. The denouement came with cinematic precision. They were exactly 1 minute ahead of the scheduled interception time. "Goals, 11 o'clock, higher," reported Lieutenant Douglas S. Canning, Mitchell's wingman, the first to break the radio silence. The distance was about 5 miles, with an altitude difference of 6,000 feet. 8 planes in perfect formation, exactly where they were supposed to be. 2 Betty bombers in bearing formation, and 6 Zeros in 2 formations, completely unaware of the 16 Lightning planes gaining altitude below and behind them. Mitchell immediately gave the order to drop the overhead tanks. "Dump the tanks! All groups, get to work!" The 165-gallon tanks spun, falling into the ocean as the P-38 dropped the resistance-defying burden. The engines were switched to emergency combat mode, producing 1,475 horsepower each. The Lightning accelerated to 300 miles per hour, gaining altitude at a maximum sustained speed of 2,800 feet per minute. The strike group was to attack the bombers, while Mitchell led a cover group above to intercept any fighters from Kahili. Battle over the Bougainville jungle. Captain Lanier saw how the escort Zeros began to react. They spotted the approaching P-38s and, dropping their outboard tanks, went to intercept. Standard Japanese tactics: protect the bombers by attacking the attackers. Lanier made an instant tactical decision that would later generate decades of controversy. Instead of continuing to move towards the bombers with Barber, he turned around to meet the diving Zeros head-on. His arguments, which he would later put forward, were to eliminate the threat from the escort and allow Barber to attack unhindered. His critics will argue that he was hunting for easy glory, preferring to shoot down fighter jets instead of the main target. Lieutenant Barber maintained his course towards the bombers, who were now desperately diving towards the jungle canopy. The lead Betty went into a steep dive. The pilot was trying to reach the height of the treetops, where the advantage of the P-38 in speed would be minimized, and the jungle would provide shelter. Barber steered his Lightning into a 45-degree peak, and the airspeed indicator went over 400 miles per hour. The distance was closing rapidly. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. Barber opened fire with all his weapons from 500 yards away. 4 jets of caliber bullets, 50 and 20 millimeter cannon shells converged on the right engine and the wing root of the bomber. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The right engine of the Betty exploded in orange flames. The wing spar was destroyed by concentrated fire. The bomber violently rolled over on its left side, completely out of control. Barber pulled the handle sharply to avoid a collision. His P-38 groaned under overload, and he caught a glimpse of the Betty's fuselage disappearing into the jungle canopy, leaving a trail of fire and debris in its wake. A black column of smoke marked the point of impact. One bomber was shot down, but which one was Yamamoto on? Barber couldn't have known that while he was looking for the second bomber. Holmes and Hine initially followed Barber, but fell behind during violent maneuvering. Holmes spotted the second Betty low over the water, fleeing south along the Bougainville coast at top speed. Vice Admiral Ugaki's pilot chose a different escape route, diving towards the ocean rather than into the jungle, hoping to use the water surface to prevent attacks from below. Holmes went on the attack, but his speed of approach was excessive. He fired a long burst that damaged the Betty's right engine, causing a white trail of leaking fuel and oil, but missed without causing decisive damage. Barber spotted the second bomber after Holmes's approach. The Betty was barely 50 feet above the waves, its damaged engine smoking. Barber fired ahead of time, taking the target 30 degrees forward to take into account its speed. His first burst went through the water, raising geysers of spray, then rose up into the fuselage of the bomber. Large pieces of metal plating flew off. Some with audible impacts crashed into Barber's P-38. The Betty's left engine caught fire. The pilot tried to make a controlled landing on the water, but hit the ocean at speeds over 100 miles per hour. The plane broke apart on impact, the fuselage separated from the wings. Meanwhile, Lanier engaged Zero's escort in a violent vertical scissors maneuver. His superior speed on the P-38 allowed him to conserve energy, while the lighter Zeros relied on their maneuverability. Lanier claimed to have shot down 1 Zero during this fight, describing how it rolled over and fired a burst into the roots of its wing, causing an explosion. However, Japanese records do not show losses among escort fighters. The remaining Zeros, led by Ensign Yanagi, focused on driving away the American fighters rather than engaging in a decisive battle. Their main mission, the protection of the bombers, has already failed catastrophically. A cover group led by Mitchell watched the fighters from the Kahili airfield. The expected swarm of 75 Zeros has not been materialized. Either the surprise effect was complete, or the Japanese fighters were deployed elsewhere. Mitchell maintained an altitude advantage of 18,000 feet, ready to dive at any interceptors. Below, the strike group completed its attacks and headed back on course. The whole fight lasted less than 10 minutes. The time above the target is perhaps 4 minutes of real combat, returning from the brink. The success of the mission depended on which bomber Yamamoto was in. Barber's plane suffered significant damage during the battle. 104 holes were counted on his car from the return fire of the bomber's 7.7mm defensive machine guns and, possibly, from the Zero fighters. Hydraulic fluid oozed out of the punctured lines, leaving reddish streaks along the fuselage. One engine was running intermittently, possibly due to debris or combat damage, but both Allisons continued to function, and the lightning remained controllable. Barber began the long journey back, constantly monitoring engine temperatures and fuel consumption. Every unusual vibration could signal an imminent engine failure over 400 miles of hostile ocean. The return flight tested the endurance and skill of each pilot. The fuel reserves of several aircraft were critically low. Lieutenant Holmes had problems with the engine, which forced him to reduce power, and he fell behind the line. Radio discipline was partially respected, despite the temptation to coordinate actions or call for help. Each pilot was left alone with his calculations, calculating whether there would be enough remaining fuel to make it home. The math of survival was played out simultaneously in 16 cabins. As they approached the Russell Islands, about 200 miles from home, several pilots faced critical decisions. Lieutenant Hines' fuel gauges were showing dangerously low levels. Instead of risking being drowned at sea, he could have tried to land in the alternate lane on Banaka Island. But Japanese submarines were spotted in the area, and rescue was not guaranteed. He decided to continue the flight, trusting his calculations and the reliability of the Allison engines. Mitchell's navigation on the way back proved to be just as accurate. The scattered P-38s gradually reorganized, approaching Guadalcanal. At 12:30 p.m. local time, Fighter Strip No. 2 appeared exactly where it was expected. Several planes were landing, running on the last of their gasoline. Holmes landed with choking engines. His fuel tanks were essentially dry. Others boarded with less than 10 gallons remaining, perhaps 3 minutes of flight time. The limit between triumph and disaster was measured in gallons of gasoline. After the fight, uncertainty and investigation. When the pilots turned off the engines, ground crews immediately swarmed the planes, counting the holes and assessing the damage. The main question that plagued everyone was, did they succeed? Which bomber was Yamamoto carrying? The pilots could only report 2 destroyed bombers, but it was impossible to identify the target in a fierce battle. Intelligence officers had to wait for the Japanese reaction to determine the true outcome of the mission. This wait turned out to be excruciating. That evening, as tropical darkness descended on Guadalcanal, the pilots gathered in the officers' club, a dilapidated structure made of improvised materials and captured Japanese parts. Captain Lanier, who was always aware of the importance of PR, immediately began to promote his version of events. He claimed to have shot down the Yamamoto bomber after a spectacular vertical turn maneuver, turning over and shooting at the bomber from above. His story would require him to be in 2 places at the same time, fighting the Zero and attacking the bombers at the same time. Lieutenant Barber quietly disputed this version, describing his direct, frontal attack on the lead bomber. Confirmation of success. Japanese search teams found Admiral Yamamoto's crashed bomber the next day, on April 19th. The wreckage was scattered through dense jungle about 4 miles offshore, near the village of Aku in Bougainville. The search was led by Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Tagaru of the Air Force. Yamamoto's body was found ejected from the main crash site, but still strapped into his flight seat. He maintained a dignified bearing even after death, his white glove still gripping the hilt of the ceremonial sword. A medical examination conducted by Dr. Tanaka revealed 2 bullet wounds. One bullet entered below the left shoulder blade and exited above the right eye. The other one hit him in the jaw. Death was instantaneous, probably during Barber's first attack, consequences, and legacy. The psychological blow to the Japanese Navy was devastating. Yamamoto was not just a naval commander. He was the epitome of Japanese naval tradition and strategic thinking. His understanding of the combined fleet's operations was second to none. His ability to inspire loyalty among his subordinates was legendary. His realistic assessment of American capabilities was the only deterrent to Japanese strategic arrogance. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, one of Yamamoto's staff officers who survived the crash of the second bomber, later described the admiral's death as a void that could not be filled. Japanese naval intelligence immediately suspected that the Americans had hacked their codes. The accuracy of the interception, arriving at exactly the right place and time after a 600-mile flight, seemed impossible to explain by mere coincidence. However, admitting to compromising the codes would mean allowing a catastrophic intelligence failure that could affect current operations. Instead, Japanese authorities claimed that Yamamoto died while leading advanced operations, maintaining the fiction that his death occurred during a routine battle rather than a targeted assassination. The American reaction was initially restrained due to security concerns. President Roosevelt received the news with grim satisfaction, but ordered absolute secrecy. Admiral Nimitz feared that publicity could reveal American code-breaking capabilities. For more than a month, the American public remained unaware that Yamamoto was dead, not to mention that he had been killed by American fighter jets. The debate about who exactly shot down Yamamoto began immediately after landing and poisoned relations between the mission participants for decades. Officially, the U.S. Air Force credited both Lanier and Barber with half of the victory, a political compromise that did not satisfy anyone. It was only in 2003, after a thorough analysis of Japanese records, evidence at the crash site, and witness statements, that historians came to the final conclusion: Rex Barber was single-handedly responsible for the destruction of Admiral Yamamoto's bomber. Major Mitchell, whose extraordinary navigation skills made the mission possible, was awarded the Navy Cross, but did not receive the Medal of Honor for which he was initially presented. The information leak caused by the premature publication in Time magazine angered the Navy command. The strategic consequences of Yamamoto's death went beyond the purely military effects. His absence eliminated the only Japanese leader who might have been able to negotiate reasonable peace terms when the war turned against Japan. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a protracted war against American industrial might. His successors, lacking his insight and influence, pursued increasingly desperate strategies that prolonged the war and increased casualties on both sides. The kamikaze tactics that emerged later in the war reflected the strategic bankruptcy that followed Yamamoto's death. Operation Retaliation demonstrated American military prowess in its most effective form. Superior technology guided by accurate intelligence, careful planning executed with tactical flexibility, individual excellence within a coordinated team effort. The synthesis of these elements killed Admiral Yamamoto, and with him, Japan's best hope for peace negotiations. The war in the Pacific continued for another 28 months, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The 16 Lightning planes that returned to Guadalcanal that April day changed the course of the war. Their pilots flew to the very edge of mechanical and human capabilities, won a brief but decisive battle, and returned to tell about it. In those few minutes over Bougainville, they achieved what thousands of bombers and millions of bullets could not achieve: the precise elimination of an irreplaceable enemy leader. The era of strategic liquidations has begun, and the war will never be the same again.